Either way, both these techniques, the on-the-spot illusion step and the stepping illusion step, are both really useful. So let's have a look at just a couple of finer points that can help us understand some key things. So first of all, we've noted that when we do the jab, we land very much on the ball of the foot as if it was an on-the-spot jab. This is very much like empty stance in traditional wushu, as we've said earlier. And this, by definition, has structural sympathy with lifting the lead leg off the floor. In a traditional empty stance, or as it's done now anyway, it's usually done very low, which makes it very difficult to lift the lead leg off the floor. But when you're doing it a little bit higher like this, it's much more practical, and you can lift up and do a kick or something like that. But what I really wanted to point out here is what you're doing with your hands. If you move your hands first with the step, it signals what you're doing, and particularly so, this is a problem with kicks. It's something you'd never really think about, but your mind gets used to spotting things, these little tells, in a way that you don't consciously think about. So if someone moves their arms first for a kick, particularly, it's a particularly bad habit with a kick, they move their arm first and then kick with the step, then people pick up on it and spot it, and it signals that you're going to kick. Or indeed just that you're going to step, so really think about that and work on it when you're practicing your steps, not signalling with your hands that you're about to step or kick. Okay, now let's take a closer look at this stepping illusion technique. It doesn't have to be a jab, but first of all, notice the footwork. Notice the lead leg lift up, and that's structurally sympathetic with just dipping the structure down and then bobbing into the next posture. Watch again. See, the lead leg lifts up and then the posture just drops a little bit and then lifts again. And we know from previous videos that we're adding volume into the posture. And we also know from this and the last video that just adding volume with a step doesn't necessarily add more power. It's got to be a particular kind of volume timed with the far lee. And it will be that lift up at the end, that lift back up into the posture, that's really going to add in that extra little bit of zing into the far lee rather than the step. So I demonstrate it here much more clearly. See the posture lift, lift and then down. It depends what you do for the first lead posture, but whenever we can, we try and maximise structural sympathy to get the best out of our postures. And of course, if you had to think about it, you could never do this. So it all just trains in naturally, it all just gels together eventually at a certain point. But next, notice the stepping, which is really clearly here a kind of crescent step. Next, notice the stepping, which is a kind of crescent step, as you can see much more clearly here. It comes in and out, and there's a really good reason for doing this that I've talked about before. If you try and step forward keeping your legs parallel, it throws your posture right off, and you can try this yourself. It's an incredibly awkward posture that throws your legs out. So bringing the leg in, this kind of crescent step that we see practiced in most Sabu, you think, well, why do that? It seems so affected. But if you try and do this step fast, keeping your legs parallel, it's such an uncomfortable, odd posture. It's like trying to walk forward carrying a football between your thighs. It just doesn't work. So we do it this way. We use our overall structural sympathy. We do a big posture first, and then we shrink down into a little posture for the step, and then we open up into the big posture. So look, big open, and then we close down again as we step. Close down, make our posture smaller, and then we open again, and we try and time it so that we maximise compensatory force, i.e. the momentum of the step. It's a very dynamic example of expansion and contraction, and also that contraction phase in the intermediate step where you're most vulnerable. That just makes you a little bit of a smaller target, although you're always vulnerable. These people who say, oh, your leg could be swept or you could get kicked in the nuts. If you've got nuts, you can get kicked in them. If you've got a leg, it can be swept. That's just the reality. So the posture itself is a little bit different to Xing Yiquan, which tends to have the leg come through much straighter. And that's usually because in Xing Yiquan, well, you do have that step through, but it very often has that pause right in the middle of the step and then go again, which serves a similar purpose to that which we are using the crescent step to serve in Yiquan. And you also don't usually have that rising and sinking in Xing Yiquan. Everything's done around the far lee and the sudden stop in the way that it's set on the front foot. We've looked at all of that before. A small number of moves in Xing Yiquan do appear to come directly from spear techniques, and that's one of them, that little half step where you stop halfway with the step rather than doing that kind of crescent step. And then the other thing to take into account, well, similar with the spear actually, is what is it you're actually trying to do? What is the finishing technique? And that will determine some elements of the posture. So with a jab, as you step through right at the last minute, you just turn onto that little pivot route, helps to stabilise the posture, as we've said before. And seeing me doing it like this, you can see this is where the Farley is right at the end. So it's a really important principle to understand, that the Farley is always a small movement. So it can't be like when people say, well, a haymaker is just Farley or something like that. That misunderstands the idea that a Farley is done within a Chinese inch. And that interlinks with a lot of other theoretical stuff that I'll talk about another time, or re-talk about on a deeper level. For now, just have a listen, and even if I do it half speed, you can hear the difference between the step and the Farley at the end. So there's always a problem with any kind of stepping that you can stub your toe, so the energy in your body is a little bit like, well, it is, you just lift your leg up slightly with the, I'm over-exaggerating it so you can see what I'm talking about, but you have to lift your leg up slightly for the crescent step so that you don't stub your toe, and then you create this big example of bow. And I've talked about before how this is a much more sophisticated idea than kinetic change. There's no actual real kinetic chain in the sense that that's usually used in terms of laws of physics. It's a structural arc, which is very different to the idea of a kinetic chain, which implies things pushing against each other in a line. This is much more the principle of an arc, i.e. bow, i.e. embrace. Now at this point I also wanted to mention something I'll come back to again, and that's the use of what we call trial of voice, or the kind of sound that you're supposed to make in each one. This is very important to me because you can probably hear sometimes in my voice I have a lot of problems with my throat, so I can't really make certain kinds of sounds without causing more damage to my throat. But it's also a really good example of how the initial theory held back development. So what really matters with trial of voice, with the sound, is that it compresses your abdomen into the, just solidifying the whole structure. It's like the final piece of the puzzle when you create the consistency for transmitting force into the strike. And the original sound was very much like this. And that is very difficult to do with combinations, fast combinations. So it negates against the development of fast combinations if you try and hold on to that sound. So what really matters is just to solidify the core. And the old way of talking about it was, if you put your hand in front of your mouth, you shouldn't be able to feel the air. Don't have your mouth open. Push down into the diaphragm as you breathe out on the strike, and keep your tongue behind your front teeth, which is sometimes talked about as like a kind of qigong thing, but actually it just stops you from biting your own tongue off. So as long as you keep to all of that, you can then modify the sound so that you can bring it into combinations. It's the same Shaolin Chuan when we were learning Shaolin Chuan, and we do ha ha on every punch. You can't do that even with a 3-punch combination. Our coach just said, right, don't do it on the 3-punch combination. Just can't be done with combinations. Well, it can, but it just doesn't make any sense. Ha 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 ha. It starts getting silly. So, and also you can do that very big sound, like a big power punch can have a startling effect on the opponent, but it doesn't.